for joining us this evening, those of you who are with us physically within this class, this room, and also those who join us via live stream. Thank you all for being with us this evening. My name is Octavio Barajas, and I'm a Bakersfield College alumnus, and also an adjunct historian and a faculty cohort member of the Energizing Humanities in California San Joaquin Valley. And tonight's talk is part of Energizing the Humanities in California San Joaquin Valley, sponsored by the Bakersfield College Social Justice Institute, the Levin Center for the Humanities, and National Endowment for the Humanities as well. And at this moment, I would like to call Professor Jack Hernandez, the director of the Levin Center for the Humanities, to say a few words.
Thank you.
You know me as Jack Hernandez, but now I've been also known as Jack the Rapper. So if you think you're dreaming, it's because we're really streaming. You gotta go to the bathroom. Baby, you gotta find it. Anyway, that's it. That's all I worked out. There is a bathroom. We don't have it. If you go out this back door and then go to your right, the next hallway down the hallway is that's a business building, and there's a bathroom there, and they'll be open while we have our program. Hey, come on in. I just want to really appreciate all the work that this group has done, Oliver and this group, in putting this together, and Gabriel for being here. What a privilege it is for us to have him. I want to mention two events coming up in the center that you might want to just note. March 8th, Anita Hill will be giving the third annual Levin lecture in the indoor theater. I mean, we can't accommodate it here, but it's 11 and it'll be free, and we haven't quite figured out how we're going to do it yet, whether we're going to have tickets at the box office, or when the auditorium is filled, we'll have gendarmes there with firearms keeping people. We don't know, but it should be a great event. And then in October, or rather April, early April 4th, I think it is, Jimmy Santiago Baca will be here, and he's a wonderful poet and a wonderful prose writer, and he will be here reading his poetry and weaving that in with his prose. So, having said all that, I gotta go back. Have a nice one.
All right. Thank you so much for those words, Jack the Rapper. We got to make a mixtape. Look forward to it. Let's see. Now, at this moment, we're gonna follow through with the introduction of our guest speaker for this evening. Gabriel Thompson is a Steinbeck Fellow in Creative Writing at San Jose State University. He's also an author and independent journalist who has written for the New York Times, Harper's, New York, Slate, Mother Jones, Virginia Quarterly Review, and The Nation. Writings by Gabriel Thompson mainly intersect on topics of immigration, labor, and organizing. His articles about labor and immigration have won a number of prizes, including the Studs Terkel Media Award and the Sidney Award. He has written 5 books, the most recent, which he edited in an oral history collection of Californian farm workers called Chasing the Harvest, which we were so lucky to have him last semester here at the Levin Center, and is also in Delano, Robert F. Kennedy Auditorium, which I was also able to introduce him there and moderate the wonderful panel that we had of members that who he interviewed for Chasing the Harvest. That Chasing the Harvest text was published in the spring of last year by Verso in collaboration with Voice of Witness, which is a wonderful nonprofit. So for today, he will be speaking about his text, America's Social Arsonist, Fred Ross and Grassroots Organizing in the 20th Century, published at the University of California Press in 2016. So until now, there has been no biography on Fred Ross, a man who believed a good organizer was supposed to fade into the crowd as others stepped forward. In America's Social arsonist Gabriel Thompson provides a full picture of his complicated and such a driven man, recovering a forgotten chapter of American history and providing a vital lessons for organizers today. Without further ado, please help me welcome Gabriel Thompson.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Oliver, for helping pull this off. I do not rap. I have only a few rules. That's a new one I'm going to make. What I thought I would do is, Fred Ross, the subject of my book, for a very small number of people is a legend. And for the vast majority of people, they've never heard of him. He was one of the most influential community organizers and labor organizers of the 20th century. He trained hundreds, actually thousands of people during his long life. The people that he trained and mentored include Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Marshall Gans, who would go on to help develop Barack Obama's 2008 field campaign, which was critical to Obama's victory. But through it all, Ross was very much in the background. I'm assuming some of you know nothing about Ross, and that's great. So it's great that you're here. So I just want to sort of introduce Ross's presence here by reading a couple of what he called his axioms for organizers. Ross spent his life organizing, but he also spent his life writing. Almost none of that writing, and we're talking about thousands of pages, actually got published. But one of the things that did get published was this little booklet called Axioms for Organizers, in which he tried to distill from decades of organizing in the field some thoughts, pithy quotes about what organizing is. And so I want to just feel a little bit of his presence here by reading a couple of those axioms. Willpower. There is no substitute for willpower in an organizer. Fast talkers. Look out for the fast talkers. The incidentals make up the fundamentals. Half-assed job. In any kind of work, if you do a half-assed job, at least you get some of the work done. In organizing, you don't get anything done. Getting a sense of him here. He takes this stuff pretty seriously. The duty of an organizer. The duty of the organizer is to provide people with the opportunity to work for what they believe in. And then finally, where I take this title of the book, social arsonist. A good organizer is a social arsonist who goes around setting people on fire. And so people have many different ideas of what organizers are, what they do. I'm not going to say any are wrong or right. They do all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, if as an organizer you're not finding new people and encouraging them to take action to make changes in their lives, in their communities, in their cities, in their states, in their country, then it's hard to say that you are indeed organizing. That's a little bit about Ross, just through his axioms. And there are actually organizers all around the country that have this little booklet. I wish I brought it. That's been reproduced, and it's bilingual now, of people, labor organizers, community organizers, kind of carrying these booklets around, and I've seen it sort of getting inspiration or having ideas from it. What I thought I'd do is talk quickly about how I came across Fred Ross, because he's not a name that's most people have heard of. And then look at two things. First of all, how he turned to the left, because as you'll see, he's not someone you would naturally think of as being on the left from where he came from. And then how he turned to organizing, because plenty of people might be on the left or progressive, but they don't spend their lives the way Ross did, sort of on the road, living out of his car and out of people's living room, organizing for decade after decade after decade. And one thing that's important to, I think, know about Ross is that he loved organizing. He's in his 70s. He's living in a primitive one-room cabin in the Bay Area, a mattress on the floor, surrounded by his papers, eking out a very minimalistic existence. He has no real savings. And not very many people know about him, and he's not very bitter at all because he feels like he got to organize and do what he wanted for all these decades. So that's one important thing to know about Ross. I first came across the name Fred Ross almost a decade ago now. I was in Arizona getting ready to work in the lettuce fields of Yuma for a company called Dole. It was for a different project looking at immigrant work, and looking at immigrant work partly by going out and working alongside immigrants. And I did not know very much about farm work or about farm work history. And so I went out and I did two things. I tried to get in shape. I did push-ups and pull-ups. And it turns out push-ups and pull-ups won't get you very far in the lettuce fields of Yuma, Arizona, or Salinas, or in the grapes probably around here. But I also went out and got a couple of books to read. And the first book I read was Grapes of Wrath. And I assume I had been assigned it in high school, but I also know that I never actually read it. And one of the things about the Grapes of Wrath that really struck me is that, just as a quick refresher, the Joad family is fleeing drought and economic devastation in Oklahoma. And they have dreams of what they're going to find in California. What they're going to find in California is they're going to have their plot of land, they're going to farm on their land, they're going to be eating grapes in the fields, taking breaks and having the juice of the grapes coming down their faces. They're going to be eating fresh, sweet oranges. It's California. It's going to be wonderful. Of course, none of that comes to pass. They arrive in California. It turns out in California that almost all the land is owned by a couple big companies. They join migrant farm workers that move from one place to the next in the state, welcome when there's crops to harvest. As soon as the crops are harvested, told to leave quickly or their little shanty towns will be burned to the ground. And in Grapes of Wrath, they basically suffer one setback after another. I think Grandpa dies on the road, and nothing works out. But their luck starts to change just outside of Bakersfield. They arrive, they've been burnt out of a shanty town or a squatter's encampment, and they arrive at a federal camp for migrant farm workers in the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley. And at this camp, everything is different. The camp is run by migrant farm workers themselves. They make their own rules. Cops aren't allowed in without a warrant. It becomes a place where they can kind of get their lives together. They start organizing a union. And coming out of, as I did, an organizing background, that camp was really interesting to me, that here was this little mini utopia in the midst of this state that was just crushing these farm workers down. And in the book, Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck calls that camp Weed Patch. The next book I read is this book called Sal si puedes. And sal si puedes in Spanish means get out if you can. This book was written in the late 1960s, and it was a profile of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers. And this was an exciting time for the United Farm Workers because they're in the midst of this great boycott, this great fight. They haven't won it yet, but everyone knows about them. And in the book, the author, Peter Matheson, asked Cesar, how did you get involved in organizing? Which is an interesting question because I tend to think of, you see leaders, you see organizers, you kind of imagine, I mean, maybe Dolores Huerta was like this, but they're born that way and they're constantly just, they're by age 2, they're fighting for justice and it's, or fighting for a bottle or whatever it is. But so he asked Cesar, how did you get involved in organizing? And Cesar says, this is 68, he says, well, it started in 1952. I was living in East San Jose, a neighborhood called Sal si puedes. And I came home from work, and my wife, Helen, said that there had been a white man at the door wanting to talk to you, wanting to talk to me. Cesar was not very excited about a white guy knocking on his door, wanting to talk to him, figures he doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And so Helen says, well, he's going to come back. And Cesar says, well, I'm glad you told me that because I'll make sure to not be home when he gets back. I'm going to go across the street to my brother Richard's house. This is Cesar telling Peter Matheson, the author, how he gets started. It happens again. This white man, who turns out to be Fred Ross, stops by. Cesar makes sure not to be there. It happens 2 or 3 times, and finally Helen says, I don't want to cover for you anymore. You're a grown man. You have kids. You're married. You can tell this guy that you're not interested yourself. So Cesar does. He stays. Ross shows up. Ross was persistent. If you can't do half-assed jobs in organizing. So he keeps coming back. But when he tells Caesar that he's trying to do some kind of community project in the neighborhood, and he'd like Caesar to hold a meeting in his living room and invite some friends so Ross could talk about what he was up to. And Caesar, very surprisingly, says yes, he would do it, even though he had tried to avoid Ross. When Ross arrives at that meeting a couple days later, he finds that the living room is packed with people. So Ross is obviously probably pretty excited. What he doesn't know is that Caesar, as he tells the story, has no interest in hearing about whatever project Ross has dreamed up. That instead, he wants to ambush Ross. And the plan he's set with his friends is that they're going to let Ross talk a little bit. And Caesar's going to be smoking a cigarette. And sometimes he's smoking it, it's the left hand, he's going to switch to his right. Sometimes it's right and the left. But at the point that he switches the cigarette that he's smoking from one hand to the other, that's a sign for them to verbally gang up on Ross and chase him out of the living room, chase him out of the neighborhood where he doesn't belong, to teach him not to kind of stick his nose in places where he's not welcome. So at this meeting, Ross, clueless about all this, starts talking to the group about what he's been up to. It's 1952, he says. He's just moved from East LA. He's been in East LA for 5 years. In East LA, the same problems that East San Jose had, cops beating up on Latinos and Latinas, about no paved streets, about no politicians paying attention to them. That's exactly what East LA was like. But in 5 years, they had started to change that. That they had created this organization called the Community Service Organization, which was a very boring name for an organization that was in fact quite militant, that wanted to build Latino political power. And that in those 5 years, they'd registered thousands of people to vote. They'd actually voted in the first Mexican-American on LA City Council in generations. And that right now in the midst, as he was up there in East San Jose, they were involved in a case that dealt with police brutality and were about to secure the first convictions for excessive force against LAPD in LAPD's history. And Ross says, what happened in East LA, we can do in East San Jose. We can do it in East Bakersfield. We can do it in Brawley. And he has this vision of Mexican-American political power being built. Well, Caesar, as he tells the story, doesn't move the cigarette. He listens. At the end of the meeting, he follows Ross outside and says, "How do I sign up?" And for the next 10 years, from 1952 to 1962, Caesar is organizing side by side with Ross throughout the state of California, organizing chapters of what they called the Community Service Organization. And after those 10 years, takes what he's learned to then go leave CSO and build what will become the United Farm Workers. So I'm still in Arizona getting ready to go in Les Fields. But I'm really struck by this vision, this story of Ross, who I've never heard of. And I look him up, and one of the only things I find about him is that one of his first jobs after college was working at a migrant camp just south of Bakersfield called the Arvin Camp, but that some people called it Weed Patch, and that it was the same camp that John Steinbeck had visited while he was doing research for what would become the Grapes of Wrath. So for me to find Ross, to find this figure who connects the Grapes of Wrath and John Steinbeck and the Dust Bowl migration of the 30s up to the farm worker rebellions and Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta of the 60s and 70s, and to find that almost no one had written about him was sort of my beginning to start trying to figure out how to write a history book, which I'd never written before. I think that one interesting thing about Ross is that he was a very unlikely radical. He was born in 1910 in Echo Park, LA, which then, he was born in San Francisco but quickly moved to LA. Then Echo Park was an all-white neighborhood. His parents, he recalled, both referring to poor people as trash. When he was in grade school, one summer, the boundaries of the school district changed. And so now his mom, Daisy, realizes that his son's going to be going to a school that has some black students in it. And so on the first day of school, she marches him down to the principal's office and demands that he be transferred back to his original all-white school because he doesn't get along with black students or kids, which of course he's never met a black kid. But that also they've been raising him to stay with his own kind, and that's the way it's going to be. And in fact, she's forceful enough that he is then transferred back to an all-white school. I am a parent now. I have 2 kids, so I have a deeper appreciation for how little control we have over our kids, I think. But Daisy was still spectacularly wrong about the life that her son would live. Staying with his own kind was the precise opposite of what he would do as he went about becoming an organizer. His turn to the left happens in a really strange place, University of Southern California, not known then as sort of hotbed of radicalism. But he gets there. At this point, his main interest, and if you look at the book, there's a photo of him. He's sort of pumped up. His main interest was going to the beach and working out with very little clothes on. And there's a photo in here of him flexing, and he looks like he's using some sort of supplements that should be illegal back in like 1930. That was his life. He really did not pay much attention to the Depression or the talk of capitalism failing or of strikes. But he gets to USC and he meets a student named Eugene Woolman. And Eugene Woolman would be an important person for Ross. Gene was Jewish from the East Coast, arrogant, brash, a communist, passionate, knew everything. Very kind of inspiring for Ross. And with Gene as his sort of teacher, Gene opens up to Ross all the exciting things that are happening in LA at that time. Together they go to the exciting/awful. They go to the main train depot in downtown LA and they watch Mexicans and Mexican Americans being loaded up on the trains to be sent back to Mexico, because they are to blame for the Depression, supposedly. They go to parks where radicals are speaking about the evils of capitalism, and then the cops come in and beat everyone up and they tear off running away. Probably the most dramatic excursion was in the summer of 1936 when Mexican citrus workers go out on strike in Orange County. They're making 25 cents an hour. They're asking for 40 cents an hour. In response, the sheriff of Orange County issues a shoot-to-kill order, deputizes hundreds of regular civilians, arms them, and says, it's your job to go crush this strike, which they do. Gene and Ross drive out, and when they get to the border where LA County becomes Orange County, there's a checkpoint. And the checkpoint is manned by USC football players and stars carrying baseball bats, demanding that everyone get out of their car, flip up the trunk of their car, and make sure they're not bringing food to the strikers. So they close their trunk, they're not bringing food, they drive into where the center of the strike is, and they've arrested so many strikers that the jails are full, so they've put up these kind of corrals, normally they corral like for cows or horses, and they've got the workers in there, and the workers are bloodied, and they're crying, and Ross writes later that's his introduction to what a strike is. So those are key moments for Ross. The other thing that Gene does is he goes, after graduating, and he goes to fight in the Spanish Civil War against Franco and the fascists, and he dies very quickly. He's killed with, I think he's killed with a bomb that lands nearby. And that death was something that Ross never forgot. In his 70s, he's doing interviews talking about how he still felt guilty that he didn't have the guts to go to Spain. And there's a document in the archives of Ross that says, my influences, and right at the top is Gene in Spain. So that was something that really stuck with him. He leaves USC, and that's when he really starts, that's when Bakersfield in the southern San Joaquin Valley really becomes important to him in terms of where his development. He can't get a job teaching. It's the Depression. And so he gets a job first handing out relief checks for the government, and then he gets the job managing this labor camp. Has anyone here been down to the Weed Patch, Sunset, Arvin labor camp? Okay. So it's still there. And it still actually is receiving Mexican migrant workers I think they usually come around May and leave in October. And they still have some of the original, they have an original building that they're renovating, so you can actually see where the Okies and Arkies were dancing. They're building it up. He gets a job there, and he gets that job right in the same year that The Grapes of Wrath has come out. And the union organizers have decided partly that they're going to try to get the workers to go out on strike that year because there's all this attention about the plight of the workers there because of The Grapes of Wrath, and they think they're going to be able to use that book to make some gains. So Ross has a front row seat at this drama. And he has some really interesting visitors. So there's these two labor organizers. I worked as a labor organizer, and we would often, you might have 100 people in your unit that you're trying to organize, and you might have 5 or 6 organizers working in that area. The organizers that were trying to pull off a statewide strike of cotton workers, there was 2 of them for the entire state. So Ross would go from tent to tent and listen to those organizers talk to the workers about the need to go out on strike to get higher wages. And the workers, you remember the workers saying that they're down with it, but it's you 2, and then who else do you guys got? And they're like, we got you guys. And Ross was, I think, both inspired by their sort of audacity, but also as things went on, we also felt like it had sort of, the organizers hadn't considered how rough the response would be. But the other person that came to visit, and I should just say, I don't know if people have seen the cover, but the other thing about Ross is he's incredibly good looking. Like, he looks like a movie star. This is Ross on the cover, and that right next to Ross is Woody Guthrie. So Woody Guthrie starts coming down to the camp and during the strike and starts singing songs to the strikers. And at night, Woody Guthrie and the strikers and the union organizers bed down in sleeping bags outside of Ross's house. Ross creates a newsletter that's for the workers, and he gets Woody Guthrie draws cartoons and writes poems for the workers. Guthrie, I think, basically wakes up in the morning and starts wandering the camp just singing songs about the need to go out on strike. And Ross, again, is watching Guthrie and watching his natural way that he interacts with the workers and is kind of taking notes. The strike starts well. People go out, but then there is a very violent response. In one rally of unarmed strikers, 200 people, armed growers and then helpers of the growers, go in with ice picks and chains and just kind of knock the strikers down. And as soon as the strikers kind of are trying to stand up bloody, they're then arrested by the cops and brought into the jail. And the strike is broken. So for Ross, I think that period was both exciting and also cautionary, that if you're going to go up against powerful interests and ask for things that they don't want to give, you need to be prepared for the response. Because if you're just leading people without a plan about what you're going to do when things get ugly, then you're not really being respectful of those people that you're trying to engage. So you really need to, organizing is serious business if you're going after this. The other thing I think was important for him was that he learned that he loved, it's one thing to like reading about poor people and organizing in books. It's another thing to deal with people as people are. They're complicated. They let you down. I'm not talking about just the strikers in Arvin. I'm talking about all of us. You start working with people, and man, we're complicated. We don't show up at meetings when we say we're going to show up, or we say nasty things that we don't think that they should have said. Ross loved that. He loved working with people, and that was a real critical, I think, discovery about why organizing worked for him, was because he was very curious about people, and he wasn't turned off by the fact that people are three-dimensional, and they're not the people you might read about in political tracts about the workers seizing power, in which it all seems very clean, and but in fact, it can get messy, and I think he really loved the mess in some ways. He didn't want to just revel in the mess. He wanted to help shape the mess, but he really loved people in a way that is important to be as an organizer. So I'm just going to skip forward a sec. So he comes out of Arvin, I think, having loved the experience. He called it a couple of the most supercharged years of my life. Eleanor Roosevelt is coming down to visit. The Arvin camp becomes a center of, because the Grapes of Wrath has come out and people know that's where John Steinbeck visited. There's a lot of people coming to just check it out. And I think Ross felt like he was in the center of the world in some ways. World War II happens, and Ross switches jobs, and now his job becomes to try to get Japanese Americans out of internment camps, who, they've been basically expelled from the West Coast, and they've been put in these camps in the interior, and Ross's job is to find jobs and housing for them so that they can be released from these essentially concentration camps. He's not organizing again, but what he's learning, I think, is the ways in which you can sort of try to bend people and move people. He's talking to employers, and he's talking to landlords, telling them, hey, the people who FDR said were so dangerous they need to be locked away, who are so treacherous that they're going to take over the country? Well, can you give them a job? Can you rent to them? And he actually did a pretty good job of doing that. But I'm going to jump forward. After World War II ends, he comes back to Southern California, and this is when this is his turn to organizing. Because right now he's mostly been watching. But he gets a job to go work in the Citrus Belt, east of LA. And I'm going to just set the scene for a sec so you can picture what it's like, what he's walking into. In much of Southern California, there are cities and towns that look very much like Jim Crow in the South. You have Mexicans and Mexican Americans going to different schools. You have them sitting in different areas of the theaters. You have them, there were things called Mexican Day, where like for the pool, the city pools, one day would be Mexican Day. The city of Orange had Mexican Day. Mexican Day was Monday. Monday, all the Mexican kids would come and swim in the pool. Tuesday, the city drained the pool entirely of all its water. Wednesday, they replenished it with clean water that had not been contaminated by brown-skinned kids, and it was reopened for white kids. So this is sort of, you walk down the street and you'd see stores that have white trade only signs. You have the KKK kind of asserting on the rise a bit again. So he's walking into this kind of environment and going into these. You also have the fact that there's a very clear separation of work. Latinos and Latinas worked in the fields. They often, dropped out of school to work in the fields. They weren't supposed to complain. They're happy in their position. They're quiet. They lived on the other sides of the tracks. So Ross, that's sort of the environment in which he moves into this world. And his original plan is has been told to, that he's going to create these councils of civic unity. It's this term that people used back then, which were these multiracial groups of more or less professionals, whites, blacks, Latinos, who would in some way meet and make things better. What he found in creating these committees is that what they would do, I think, is meet, seat, eat, repeat, and retreat. So they would have these meetings, they'd talk about stuff, they'd eat, they'd make plans, and then the main plan they'd make is the next month, what time they were going to meet, what kind of food they were going to eat. And he very quickly lost hope in that as a way to try to challenge the racist organization of these cities and towns. Partly because white people didn't feel the sting. They might feel bad about it, but they weren't actually the ones who were feeling the abuse directly. And the small class of Latinos who had sort of risen, or Latinas who had risen and were small business owners who were had made it a little more, felt like they were afraid of stepping on the toes of the white power structure because it might impact them in some negative way. So he very quickly comes to the conclusion that the people who he needs to organize who will stick their neck out are the manual laborers, are the farm workers, are the housewives, are the people who have really felt the sting of the arrangement most directly. And he also comes to the conclusion that one of the key problems here is political power, that Mexican Americans are not registered to vote at very high levels. If they're registered, they're not voting. And so it's very easy for the white power structure to kind of just ignore them or pay lip service. And he's pushed in this direction about the need to do voter registration by a guy named Ignacio Lopez. Ignacio Lopez is this really incredible figure in California history. He's an agitator, he's an organizer, he's also a publisher of a newspaper, I think it was called El Espectador, The Witness, and he uses this newspaper to highlight all of the abuses that are going on in the community. And he sits down with Ross and says, Ross, look, you need to go in, and without the vote, it's going to be hard to see progress happening. So Ross goes into a small community in Riverside called Casablanca. And Casablanca has a problem with a guy named Ben Rathgeber. Ben Rathgeber is a city council person who represents Casablanca. Unfortunately, he's also a citrus grower. And many of the workers in Casablanca are citrus workers. And that same strike that Ross and Gene had gone to check out in 1936, well, during that period, that strike reached Riverside, and workers had gone out on strike, and Ben Rathgeber had taken that as a personal insult. They had struck his citrus groves. And so he had gone out of his way to make sure that he was going to punish the people, actually hit part of his constituency. When Ross arrives in 46, he has just voted against a bill that would have brought a playground to Casablanca because the workers had struck him, therefore the kids of those workers don't get a playground. And Ross goes around the room as people are complaining about this guy and asks how many people are registered to vote, and very few hands go up. But he recruits a group of people to go door to door doing an extensive voter registration campaign. And I think there's an election within a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. During this period, Ben Rathgeber is totally oblivious. He actually goes on vacations in Mexico. He's so certain he's going to win. And on election day, the organization that they've created, the general store of Casablanca, has become the headquarters. There's a huge map on the wall that has every house in Casablanca. There's a team of people that go out and are supposed to bring people to the polling station. Ross actually has gotten sample ballots to take people, walk them through how to vote, because most of them hadn't voted before. This is actually a couple years later in East LA. He will not only do that, he'll rent a voting booth so that people can, some part of it was people had never done this before. They don't want to walk into the voting booth and feel stupid and not know what's going on. So he actually rents a voting booth so people can do it. The day of the election, people go out. They bring people to the polling place. If they see them go in, they call back. They're marked off. If they go visit the person says, I'm not interested anymore, Ross calls up the local priest. The priest makes a house call. The priest takes them, because now they're going, or else they're going to hell. Ross was not religious, but he used religion all the time in his organizing. And there's a truck that's driving through the neighborhood. It says, Justice for Casablanca. There's a loudspeaker person shouting, imploring people to go vote. At the end of the day, long story short, Rathgeber is voted out. He's voted out solely because Casablanca has by far the highest voting of any precinct in Riverside. It's so surprising because no one's ever really voted in Casablanca that the next day in the paper, the city council person, who's now no longer going to be a city council person, calls for an investigation into whatever strange things had happened in Casablanca. But he won. But Ross's campaign and the people that lived in Casablanca won. There's a few things that Ross takes from this that I think, for me, doing this book, and I'm not talking much about the UFW because I think you'll see these traits that he's developing now, you'll see them throughout the UFW. Some of the lessons he takes from this 2-year period in the Citrus Belt. One, you want to leave as little as possible to chance. You do whatever you can. The forces are aligned against you. You don't have the advantages of money. And so he would try to do whatever it was to win or to find a victory. He was fanatical about it. 2, and sort of related, pay attention to details. There's no such thing as, you might have great ideas about what you want to do. Voter registration is a perfect example. If you don't know how people are going to get to vote, to the voting booth, if you don't have system in place of cars to bring old people who don't have other ways, if you don't have checks about how make sure things are happening, all those great plans can become nothing. And in fact, Marshall Gans, who I mentioned before with the UFW, mentioned that to me in an interview, when Ross came into the UFW, it shifted the whole feeling of organizing at the UFW. Before, Gantz thought of organizing as something kind of cool you did. You hung around, you passed out flyers, you talked about making things better. But that Ross was a master craftsman, and he came in and he said, you have to have a system. If you can't count it, it didn't happen. How many people came to the meeting? How many people were moved to do these things? So he approached this as Gantz told me, a master craftsman. 3 was look for the women. In his early campaigns, it was by far the women who were driving them. They were the ones going door to door. They were the ones challenging people in power. And at the end of this process, these 2 campaigns, he writes this, for me it was remarkable to discover, a 100-page report about what he's learned during the period. And he very straightforwardly says any organizer needs to pay at least half as much attention to the women leaders, to women as men, because they make diligent, natural, fearless leaders. That, in 1946, 1947, Ross was way ahead of his time. And I think that's important not just to think about how he was striking out for gender equality, but that it made him a much better organizer, because he didn't have the blind spots that a lot of organizers did who thought that leaders were men. And then finally, returning that it was going to be the ordinary people. It was going to be the people who weren't affiliated, the people who weren't sitting on the boards of the local companies or the local community boards, who were going to drive the work. And they may not be the people who in the meetings step up and are eloquent and had the best education, but they're going to be the people, not when it comes time to do speeches, but when it comes time to go and do the door knocking and do the work that often is so thankless, that we'll be doing that. So let me just finish by saying why I think Ross matters, and then we'll open it up for questions, critiques, comments. The most obvious reason I think that Ross matters is the people that he trained and that he inspired. So, if you think about the grape strike and the boycott from 65 to 70 that captured the nation, you can't understand how Cesar Chavez ends up on the cover of Time magazine in 1968 if you don't also know that Fred Ross in 1952 was knocking on doors in East San Jose and refusing to take no for an answer. That the people that came out of his work, not just Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, the big names, but hundreds and hundreds of people who then went on to train hundreds and hundreds of more people in the techniques that are still being used today. I think that's a real testament to kind of to the importance of Ross's life. 2, I think that the techniques, and I get into this in the book, the techniques that he's kind of pioneers are still being used today. And I was an organizer in Brooklyn. I remember we were doing a house meeting campaign where it was around lead paint poisoning, and the guy that was kind of my mentor at this period was the one running it. And he's teaching me how to do these house meeting campaigns. We're meeting with families who have kids who are poisoned, and they invite their friends and families to come to these meetings to talk about how we need to make change on a citywide level, and then it kind of spirals. It's not until I started working on this Fred Ross book that I realized that the person who was my mentor back then had been trained by Ross, and that Ross had been one of the person who had really pioneered this house meeting technique, which Howard Dean, Barack Obama, it's just a staple. Right now, tonight, there are hundreds of house meetings around a gazillion issues happening now that have their roots in Ross's organizing in the Citrus Belt in the 40s. And the final thing I think why I felt that this book was important, why I thought it was important to lift up Fred Ross, is that he is one person, he's an organizer, but he also is sort of a standing in for organizers generally, who, as Ross mentions, an organizer is a leader who does not lead but gets behind the people and pushes. And in many ways, that's what he did, and he did such a good job that he pushed himself right out of most history books. And so this is a chance to remember not just Ross, but all the organizers who slowly in small ways have made the world a better place, and a reminder that history is made in quiet places and is made also by people not behind the mic. So, thank you. that concludes me.
At this point, we're going to make a transition to the Q&A part of this talk. And just before we make that transition, I wanted to make a plug for Russo's book. We have a gentleman outside who's selling this book here tonight. So, and this is a text, as you can see, that emphasizes one of the major things that re-energizing the humanities is about, right? So emphasizing place-based pedagogies. And as you can see, this work is really exalting the area that we all have the privilege to walk upon, right? San Joaquin Valley. So it's a very important book. Another round of applause for Gabriel, doing a great job. He's covering a lot of the intricate experiences and details that this book actually contains. So I encourage you to get a copy and maybe get it autographed here with Gabriel before the night is over. So without further ado, let's make this transition. And yes?
I want the first question.
Well, since I'm modern, I think I might have been. I'm just kidding. Go ahead, please, follow.
Well, not every. Thank you, Gabriel. That was wonderful. I've read the book, and it's such a pleasure to hear you speak about it. For those who have not read the book, but maybe are familiar with this whole concept of like grassroots organizing, like I'm thinking of Saul Alinsky. Like you mentioned Saul Alinsky a lot in your book, that the correspondence between him and Ross. Saul Alinsky had a great comeback with Glenn Beck, right, and Fox News and conservative commentators talking about the evils, right, of this kind of leftist organizing tradition, and that genealogy from Alinsky to Marshall Gans to Barack Obama. And so I was wondering if you could actually comment and clarify Ross's position on the left and his anti-communism.
Yeah. It's complicated because I think one thing to think about with Ross is that the early influences for him, the early heroes to him were communists. Not because they were communists. I don't know that he was incredibly interested, except during his college years, in ideology per se, the way we think about, was not someone to get into sectarian debates about communism, but that the people he saw, the person, Gene Woolman, who went to go fight in Spain, he also saw Gene Woolman actually try to organize a plant in LA, who he saw kind of laying their lives out on the ground, on the line. One of the union organizers who comes to Arvin, who meets with Ross, has just got back. Well, he's just gotten out of jail from trying to lead a previous strike up in Northern California. But before that, he was in Spain for 3 years as well, and was a communist who had fought against fascism in France. So Ross had a lot of. I think he in some ways was in awe of seeing these folks, and so he didn't have a visceral anti-communist response to that. But he operated, especially when he creates the community service organization, that's founded in 1947. It's founded right as the House On-American Activities Committee is having hearings into the influence of communism in Hollywood. He's on the east side of LA. This is in LA. He's in a neighborhood that's considered, he's organizing Boyle Heights at this point. This is the most leftist, most subversive neighborhood. And so he's and also he's chased out of the Citrus Belt by becoming through he's slandered as being a red. And that's how they call him a communist, and that's how they actually destroy one of his organizing. He's trying to organize workers, and they call him a Red Ross, and people kind of fall away, and he has to move on to a new place. So he's starting this organization to organize Mexican Americans for political power right when McCarthyism is at kind of its full swing, right after he's been chased out of an organizing campaign through red baiting. And so he was very conscious of the delicate nature of what he was doing. I think that's one of the reasons they called this organization the Community Service Organization. I think Saul Alinsky said it made the junior league sound militant. But it was the point was to make it as controversial as possible. And he has a line in which he's writing to Alinsky, and he says something along the lines of making sure there's someone in the early days of organizing CSO who says they want to have a rule that communists can't join, and he basically says no, we're not going to do that, and he finesses away so that they never, unlike other organizations like the NAACP and others, they never have a rule that communists can't join. At the same time, he was very aware of the fact that there are communists that wanted to use the CSO to get in there to kind of build a base and, as he would see it, hijack it for their own purposes, and he really did not want that to happen. He wanted people to be loyal to the organization. He didn't want people to have ulterior motives, and so he would try to make sure to marginalize folks who he thought were trying to take it down a different direction. Later on, though, there was a period in the 70s, and I interviewed people who thought that Ross was a real red baiter, like who was extremely anti-communist. And I think what that came out of was, and again, I wasn't there, but that in the 70s there were various Maoist groups who were showing up at UFW meetings and organizing, and I think Ross considered them, as he mentioned, kind of kooks. That they were, it was this guy Bob Avakian, kind of a cultish following, and that while they were trying to organize lettuce workers in Salinas and what he considered a very clean campaign, they were talking about Mao and the need to align with China, and he just was like, he had very little tolerance for that. He felt like that was just going to, if anything, destroy the work they were trying to do. So I had a more nuanced view of his thoughts about communism, that his main concern was it going to get in the way of the organizing? His relationship with, Alinsky is such a weird person for people to latch onto as this conspiratorial radical who wanted to subvert the I don't know what they thought exactly, because he definitely was not a communist. So it's hard to, because if you read the way he talks about social change, it's actually it's pretty straightforward, and there's nothing, it's that social change comes from people doing battle. It doesn't come from asking nicely and then people come down and give. I mean, that's like Frederick Douglass. That's King. There's nothing particularly revolutionary about that. I think what was different at the time with Alinsky was that social workers had an idea that he upended, that to be a social worker and to make things to make progress, you just had to share a lot of good information about best practices with people. So if you share information about best practices, predatory lending to Wells Fargo will look at that and think that's a really good idea, and then they will change their policy, which I think both Ross and Alinsky felt like that was nonsense.
Time for another question.
Did you go?
Okay.
So, did his parents approve his work?
No. I think honestly they just didn't know. It just didn't make sense. They weren't sure what he was doing. He had a younger brother, Bob, who went into business, made millions of dollars, had a house in Beverly Hills, drove I can't remember what kind of fancy car. That made sense to their parents. That was a career. That was being a lawyer or something else. What Ross was doing, driving around, spending months at a time in motels in Bakersfield while his family's up in the Bay Area, doing God knows what in Brawley and Fresno and San Bernardino, I don't think it really, they didn't approve, but also it was just it was baffling, Here was a guy who was really smart, who'd gone to school, who could become, do what he wanted to, whatever he wanted to do, and he was doing this thing with Mexicans, and what was it exactly? And so I think they didn't approve, but more than that, they didn't understand. This was a time, I think now there's a little, we've had a president who was a community organizer. There's a little more idea that community organizing is a thing that people do. Back then in the 50s, I think there was just a lot more confusion about what he was up to. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me about Ross was his personal life,
Yeah.
and to some degree also with Dolores Huerta. Could you talk about, he was so committed and on the road so much, and this was his life, but he had a family, and it seemed to me that he couldn't quite square the two. And that may be common for that kind of commitment, but anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, so Ross, I mean, this is probably the most difficult thing for me to try to include in the book because it's, well, first of all, there's just a lot of pain in there. Interviewing he has 3 kids, and interviewing those 3 kids, in different ways you would see the impact of their dad being gone so much. I'll just tell you, this is an extreme example, but it gets to a sense of it. Ross's second wife was struck with polio, and so it's unclear if she was being released from the hospital after months and months of painful treatment and was being brought home. I think that's what was happening, was going to be brought home for the first time. And so Ross was supposed to, this is a story told by Ross's daughter, was supposed to be in the house to receive her, but also have gotten a special bed, like a hospital-style bed, and that when she got home, he wasn't there. He was at an organizing meeting, and either the ambulance had to turn around and go back to the hospital, or they just dropped her off kind of at the house alone, maybe on the ground. I find that seems less likely than having gone back, being brought back to the hospital. But it spoke to his commitment to organizing. But what really spoke to it as well was that I talked to someone that Ross had trained years later, and he mentioned that exact same story, but he mentioned it that Ross told that story as a way to describe the proper priorities of an organizer. And so there's a real a part of this of Ross's dedication is I don't get a huge sense that he suffered too much from it. I think he would not have liked it to have been as it was, but that he had made a commitment very clearly that his main purpose on life was organizing, and that family was at best a second priority, but that the pain that comes out of that from his kids and then also from his wife is evident. Which brings, we've done a number of events with groups that are doing organizing today, and organizers, and they flagged us a lot, like the idea that that's a challenge they always have to struggle with, but that is also, it's very gendered. The reason he could be out all the time is because his wife was always home with the kids. But that, and he was not criticized the way that Dolores was. I mean, they lived parallel lives, except that he was a man doing it and she was a woman doing it. But that there's been a lot of progress in terms of thinking about organizers are not just one-dimensional people, and that they have families, and thinking about having a more well-rounded orientation. But Ross, to the end, I think, thought that to be a good organizer, you had to push everything else at times aside. And there were a lot of people who he trained who went on to become great organizers, including his son, who is just as dedicated, but who has carved out time to be with his family. But there's a lot of people who heard the way that Ross described organizing and were like, if that's what organizing is, that's not for me,
Time for another question?
We were discussing, as a good organizer, how does he get paid? It's not like, someone asks him to get up and talk and you get paid for it, like some politician gets funding and sponsors, so is that how an organizer gets his earnings and raised?
Yeah, so for him, things have changed a little bit because organizing has become more professionalized. It's a kind of a legitimate way in which funders can support organizations, thinking this is a means to social change. Back then, there wasn't that network of foundations that fund organizing. So a lot of times, he didn't get paid very much, but one of the things that really helped him in this 15-year period when he was organizing with the CSO was that Ross was terrible at raising money, maybe because he also had no interest in doing it, but Saul Alinsky was great at raising money. Alinsky loved thinking up ideas. He loved writing. He had great one-liners. But Alinsky was never going to be someone door-knocking for months at a time in Bakersfield. It bored him to death. Ross might not come up with good one-liners. He might not be the best fundraiser, but he actually loved the day-in, day-out grunt work of organizing. So Alinsky was able to raise a lot of money from Chicago with different foundations that then supported Ross's work out here in California specifically. So there was a period in which he had a pretty steady paycheck. The other thing is that his wife worked full-time. She eventually recovers from her polio. She has a very successful professional career before they divorce, before she divorces him, and so she also is helping with that. But it was a challenge, and like I said, by the end he doesn't have very much savings. He's living in an arrangement that almost none of us, I think, would imagine. That's how we want to be spending our late 70s. So he was very much a kind of aesthetic figure.
A quick question, he never wrote any books or became an author in, his life work at all?
So he did publish, he had a book that he called The Book, which was going to be his grand book on organizing. In 1968, he writes to someone trying to get a book contract saying he's got 1,500 pages written thus far. But he hasn't actually gotten into the whole great boycott yet. And then he works on that writing through up until the end of his life, kind of. I think he thought that 1,500 pages would be impressive to a publisher. In fact, for most publishers, you think, oh, something's going on here. This is someone who's not able to edit down. And so writing was a real struggle for him. So he did publish a small book towards the end of his life about a really interesting period in which Cesar Chavez is beginning his first farm worker organizing in Oxnard in 57 and 58, and that's called Conquering Goliath. So that's a small book that he wrote. But no, the massive, and it became kind of a running joke, I think, among people that, oh yeah, Ross is there working on his book, because he would come into the union for a little bit, and then he'd go back and work on his book, and come in, and he would carry this huge stack of documents, which was at his book. But writing was a challenge, I think he was a little bit of a perfectionist. I know he's a perfectionist. In organizing, it's okay if you're a perfectionist, because at some point you have to go out and actually do the stuff. But in writing, you never have to show the writing anyway. You can keep crossing it out. And so when you look at his manuscripts, you'll see that he'll change he'll mark it to guy, and then the man, and then he just it's none of those changes mean much or change much, but he was just constantly kind of making these additions, and he never had a good editor. And so that was, I think one of the things I thought it was important to have this book too is that there's a lot of wealth in those. You might not want to read those 1,500 pages. You don't, I did. But there's stuff in there that's important, that's interesting, that I think kind of is worth not having it all just sit in archives seen by 8 people a year.
I have a question about kind of the emotional side of him. I see that he has these ups, downs, but he seems to be kind of pragmatic and resistant and resilient to people. Does he ever get depressed? Because sometimes things just didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what did you kind of see that in his writing, that side of him, or or was he just kind of had the ability to be resilient?
Yeah, I think constitutionally he did not have the kind of soul-searching moments of am I in the right path? Is this and it's hard to know why was that. You know, it's not exactly there was this faith, I guess, that it was never over, that this was the best thing that he could possibly be doing. It was a thing he was made to do, and that setbacks were just part of it. You know, there was a line where Chris Snyder, who works with UFW, who's taking photos right now, knew Ross very well. There's a line where the UFW has suffered they're probably their most emotionally devastating defeat. They've tried to push a proposition through the state. They've been destroyed. They got beat back. The proposition just did terribly. Up to this point, UFW has kind of had one victory after another. They're looking at invincible. Jerry Brown has advised Caesar not to take on this fight because he doesn't think he's going to win. But they do it. Ross works around the clock. He's constantly trying to gather signatures for this petition. And there's a scene where they're in a bar in San Francisco watching the returns come in from this, I think it was Prop 14. And at the end of the night, they're expecting to be a victory event, and they lose. And people are just kind of devastated. People have worked themselves sick over this campaign. They've come in from all the boycott houses from around the country to all work on this campaign. And one of Ross's kind of stalwart volunteers looks at Ross and says, "So what are we doing tomorrow?" And Ross, in his writings, has this, he mentions like that was just like, for him, the ultimate response. Like, yeah, we had this setback, what are we doing tomorrow? Which, that's not how almost any of us would actually approach that, but he had that kind of, that constitution. And that allowed him to do his organizing for so many decades, and I don't exactly know how to account for it.
Especially since you have someone who knew him here, I'm just curious. He didn't seek the limelight, obviously. As you said, he wanted to push someone else forward. What was he like, though, when he entered your room? Was he charismatic? Was he funny? Was he eloquent? What was he like?
I also worked with Fred and Chris, both of us. You've done an excellent job, actually. You've caught a lot of Fred. He was quiet, but he was also extremely demanding and a taskmaster. And he had no sympathy for people who were fearful. In the boycott, he didn't like us having offices because if you're in an office, you're sitting on your ass. Your office was your car or the subway, and you were to be on the road talking to people, doing the house meetings. He trained us and trained us and trained us on the house meetings, and if we left a house meeting without at least one card from everybody in there, it was a failure. And you had to get at least one more house meeting out of that meeting, or you go back. He was an interesting man.
Having Fred
Was he
critique
charming
your
in that?
meetings.
Was he charming? Did he use humor, or was it?
Yes, and he was multi-dimensional. I was young, and I was the guy who was getting my ass kicked out to go out, and he would lecture us about not being proud, that we were doing a disservice to everybody by being proud, and that you're not asking for money or you're not asking for things for yourself, you're asking it for people who can't. So get your ass out there and do it. That was Fred.
One of the things that I don't know that some people in interviews told me, and I don't know if this will ring true to you. Well, first of all, yeah, he's often the guy in the background. Maybe not when he's running the trainings as much, where he's sort of the guy that, but in meetings of organizers, people that talk about him just like standing in the back with his arms crossed, listening, but listening in a way where you could have kids screaming over here, you could have music blasting, and he's right there. His focus was seemed amazing. But that, yeah, and I would be curious if that when he criticized people, it almost like there wasn't as much of an ego or of a, it was almost like how they felt about that was immaterial. It was like, this is what we need, these are the things you have to do, and we're not here to make sure that we all feel great about everything, but these are the things that it means to be, and sometimes he could come across even meaner that way because he just wasn't able to put himself in the mindset of the 20-year-old who's hearing what he's saying and the way he's saying it. I don't know. Which some people, there are some people who just walked out of it and it's like, I feel like I just was broken down, which I don't think was his point. But it's how people took it,
Another question?
So first of all, I really enjoyed this book. It was very engaging.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just really enjoyed it. But my question is, since you're familiar with Ross's organizing methods and tactics and being an organizer yourself, what tactics do you think that you can take from this book to adapt to a more social media age? I mean, like your Casablanca story, and so much of what you've been emphasizing here is very interpersonal, very face-to-face, very community-oriented, and so I just wondered if there's anything we can take from this that is adaptable to any method of communication.
You two could jump in here too. Ross was not a technophobe, I mean, I know that he early on would have video cameras and would actually videotape people making the pitch for the organization, and so that they could see themselves on the screen, and they would feel like they had like lots of animo, they're really excited, and then they'd show that up on the screen and you'd see in fact that they were very hesitant, and so he really tried to use whatever technology was there. I think that you can't separate the importance of face-to-face conversation in the way that Ross thought about organizing, because you had to be able to count, and I'm also not a huge social media is incredibly powerful, but I think for Ross it's hard to think of how it's kind of amorphous. So you got X number of impressions on that tweet or whatever, but how would that translate into people showing up? And it does, I guess. It can translate into people showing up and at a meeting and demanding something from a politician. But he also, in his organizing with the CSO, and I think there was a real emphasis on creating space in which people are talking to each other and hashing through issues. He had thrashing things out was a phrase he always wrote about. I don't know if he said that as much, but it's always thrashing things out. And that social media is a pretty tough place to thrash things out in that way. So I'm not sure if you look at one of his long-standing campaign key accomplishments that he thought was about voter registration. He looked at voter registration as very much something that comes out of local precinct captains that are going about issues affecting the neighborhood, that take a lot of accountability, so that if someone says they're going to go out and they're going to knock on these doors and bring home these people, they got to bring them home. And not only are they door knocking to get voters to register, but they're going to recruit 3 or 4 people who are going to go register with them the next day. And you needed a whole system to like make sure every night. I mean, they would have meetings in the morning, at night, to make sure that are those things happening? Are they not happening? Well, did they not happen? Describe what you said at the door. Oh, here's something that kind of piercing maybe the weaknesses, or not exploring ways in which you can get better. And a lot of the voter registration stuff has been very geared towards, especially with Latinos and energizing the Mexican American vote now, of showing up at a huge concert of a big artist and handing out information, or Voto Latino with kind of savvy campaigns online that haven't accomplished the goal of increasing voter registration. So I think it's not that social media is not very important as we move forward, but that some of the weaknesses that it has, I think, of accountability, of results, of follow-through, of sitting down and meeting people face-to-face, are things that Ross has a struggle with. You know, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta didn't get turned on to politics by reading a tweet or a Facebook post. And so I think it's a reminder, too, of the ways in which there are different... When people say everything about organizing is changing with social media, I think it's Ross is someone who would want to push back a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I think in his axioms for organizers, one of the quotes is, "There's no such thing as a shortcut." And social media, people try to use as a shortcut for, "Hey, Nick, are you going to come to the picket line today? I promise." That's a whole lot different than sending Ned a text, "Hey, you going to show up?" And I think Fred would see social media as an interesting tool that can help for mobilization, but not for organizing.
Not a substitute.
Not substantive thing, because we all go to rallies where we saw on social media, we're going to have this march or that march. A lot of people show up, but then nothing. There's no follow-up. There's no. They don't get the names of everyone there. They don't get the contact information. They don't get people to commit to come to the meeting the next day on what do we do now that we've had all these people come together. So I think, I think one of what I'm up in Fresno, and what I see happening in Fresno is there are a lot of organizations that say they're organizing, but they're really doing social media blast, and they're not building the organizations that are going to bring about the political power. I think Fred would want to find a way to utilize it, but he would not say there's a social media organizer campaign.
So he would do the thing that you were talking about, though, a little bit. You'd have the big famous Hollywood person. Chris Christopherson, for example, did a concert for the union. Did a couple of them. And Fred's concept, which Cesar carried through on, was there'd be 200 UFW people at that concert getting every single person's name, phone number, and address. And then the next question Fred would ask is, okay, now that we have 5,000 cards, what are you going to do with them? And when are you going to see them? And what are you going to get out of it? And all that stuff. There wasn't just having a concert to raise awareness. That was a waste of space, and he wouldn't engage in it. There had to be a plan, and there had to be a path that you wanted to get to.
It can be tough too if you subtract the face-to-face entirely. Then a lot of what Fred would talk about in UFW is moving people to different places. So you learn what are they interested, what are they comfortable doing, what are they in, what brought them into this campaign, what would they. So that actually has to be a conversation. And so if you're going to bring people into different levels of leadership, It just has to kind of slow down. But they did do a lot of, sort of proto-social media, like, all the, I just feel like they could have really, they found ways to capture massive amounts of people and broadcast it in a way that clearly showed, the same way like a Me Too type thing on Twitter kind of amplifies, shows suddenly that people are all talking about this. I mean, they got people all talking about the great boycott through, They had bumper stickers.
They come off real easy.
That was the big lie. Is this bumper sticker ever gonna come off real easy? Put it on there, it'll come off real easy.
Another question? Another question here, Elizabeth.
I'm interested in the process when you get to know Fred Ross. You said you just came across his name and found one thing written about him, and here you are kind of channeling his ideas, and we get a really good understanding of what this person was like. Can you talk a little bit about how that came about? Going back in history, and does your experience as an organizer yourself, you think that made you a good person to do this, that you could understand what it was coming from?
It was helpful to definitely get a sense, mostly in terms of knowing how hard it was, because I wasn't a particularly good organizer. I did it for 4 or 5 years. Ross would consider that a blink, but to have a sense of how difficult it is. I met with Fred Ross Jr., his son, soon after expressing interest. Fred Jr. also went into an organizing career and opened up a lot of doors for me to be able to meet people like Dolores Huerta. And through those interviews, I think I learned a lot, but also Fred had this incredible amount of archival documents that he left around the country. And so I could go to these archives and read him writing about meeting Woody Guthrie in the Arvin camp and interviewing people who had worked with him over the years and learning about the periods in which his life intersects the Dust Bowl migration, internment of Japanese Americans, the rise of Latino political power, Mexican American power in California. It's kind of like these big moments in U.S. history in the 20th century in California. So it was a combination of learning about those periods and figuring about the way that he fit in them. And yeah, you just you keep finding new things and people, and there's a lot of people who are excited to talk. The UFW, there's a lot of people in the UFW who came out of it who either left it or were forced out. A lot of inter-organizational bickering and fighting that remains to this day, where people won't be in the same rooms. Ross was someone who was mostly seen nicely by both sides. He never wasn't, some people didn't like Ross that much, but I could talk to people in the same day, interview them about Ross, and those two people hadn't talked to each other for decades. So it was also just being able to wealth of people who are excited to talk about Ross. But there's still a gap. I don't know. As I mentioned, I don't know what it was like how the temperature of a room changed when Ross walked into it. I'll never know that. And so there's always gaps, but.
If you were supposed to be out organizing and you walked in.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think this brings us to a conclusion of tonight's talk. I just wanted to.
Oh, and thank you, everyone, for coming too. I should say this is a great turnout. I really enjoyed it. And there's an independent Bakersfield bookstore that's selling the books, so out front. So if you want a copy of the book.
And thank you again, also Gabriel, for coming back to Bakersfield and giving us a wonderful talk again. And this is your home here, Bakersfield.
Yeah, I gotta have to rent an apartment.
Projects.
Cool.
So another round of applause for Gabriel. Thank you. Good job. Thank you.
Gabriel, was wonderful again.
Cool.
So much.
Yeah, no.